Welcome to the Silicon Fox podcast, where we explore the habits and stories of high performers. Join us as we dive into their journeys, analyze live blood tests, and break down the science behind key biomarkers to help you optimize your health. I'm your host, Mitchell Eschner, an ex-pro soccer player, a current sponsored hybrid athlete, a health tech founder, and a longevity enthusiast.
Hey, Tash, thank you for taking the time and hopping on the Silicon Fox podcast.
Well, pleasure to be here.
So the purpose of the pod today is we want to talk a little bit about ketogenic diet, what it is, all that kind of stuff. But I always like to start with a quick just who are you, what do you do, kind of give us that background as we hop into this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tash, and I have a background in medicine. So I trained in the UK in Bristol University, did 7 or 8 years in the NHS as an emergency doctor, and then started to get interested in health tech and tried to kind of approach things from a more global perspective. And that's how I became involved with Cyfox. So initially started in more of a kind of coaching role and helping people have one-to-ones, discussing their biomarkers and their personalized circumstances around those. And then it's transitioned into slightly more of a kind of product role with kind of like the clinical aspect as well. And that's how I'm here.
Amazing. Love to hear it. Well, so let's jump in a little bit into keto. I think what I'll do is just talk a little bit about the history of keto to give the users a quick understanding of where it came from. And so it actually does go back to the 1920s as a medical treatment for epilepsy at the Mayo Clinic, funny enough. So the doctor's name was Russell Wilder. What he did was notice that when patients fasted, they had fewer seizures. He then developed this diet that kind of mimics fasting without actually making them stop eating. And that's how this high-fat, low-carb approach was born. And then for a long time, it was kind of used just for medical reasons. But then it kind of fell off the radar with new seizure medications came along and people, it was not as popularized. But then in the 90s, again, this Hollywood producer, Jim Abrams, started talking about how this diet helped his own son with, again, epilepsy. And that just got people's attention yet again. So kind of fast forward to 2000s, and people started thinking maybe this could help with weight loss too. By around 2016, 2018, ketogenic diet just blew up. It was everywhere, social media, magazines, you name it. I think Tim Ferriss definitely played a role in popularization, or UFC. But these days, while doctors use it to treat epilepsy, most people know keto as a diet where you eat lots of fat and very few carbs to get your body to burn fat instead of sugar. So pretty wild how things go from medical treatments to now this mainstream diet trend. But that is just a quick background on keto. Could you kind of just kick us off? What is keto diet? Kind of how does a well-formulated ketogenic diet actually look like?
Yeah, sure. I think that was a really great summary. And it's interesting you mentioned about it being kind of initial treatment for epilepsy. That was something we didn't get taught in med school, so I was interested to learn that as well. So in terms of the ketogenic diet, essentially it is a carb restriction diet. So you're aiming for about 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. The idea behind this is if you decrease your carbohydrate, you then also decrease your glycogen stores. And then our metabolism shifts from predominantly glycogen, which is carbohydrate based, to metabolizing fat. So our liver moves and starts transitioning to the utilization of our fatty acids from either our body and our reserve stores or from our diet. And those fatty acids are converted into what we call ketone bodies. So now they're used as our predominant fuel source as opposed to more of a carbohydrate predominant fuel source. Generally speaking, when we kind of refer to a keto diet, we're talking about kind of like a 70-75% kind of fat split, 20 to 25% protein, and you want to really minimizing your carbohydrate to be kind of 5 and 10% of your daily intake.
Got it. And oftentimes when we talk about keto, we hear about ketosis. So what specifically is that? Like, how does that tie in? Just give us that really full rundown.
Right, exactly. So ketosis is exactly this product, this kind of process where we shift from utilizing glycogen stores to shift to using ketone bodies. And because they're derived from fat stores, they're utilized in a slightly different way, and they come from a slightly different source, which is predominantly our fat stores or fat sources. So instead of breaking down our carbohydrates, we break down things like our body reserve fat and our fat intake. So whether we're eating kind of polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, etc. And the ketone bodies can be utilized in a slightly different way. Because of that lack of carbohydrate in the blood and circulating, we tend to see that we get a decrease in insulin production as well. So all these benefits kind of are tied into why the keto diet has some kind of potential metabolic benefits that we don't see from other diets.
Got it. And that actually kind of bridges to my next question, which is like, what is that key distinction from other low carb diets like Atkins or paleo that makes keto kind of a more holistically potentially better? If not, you can kind of give us your opinion there as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are loads of these diets and they're all kind of like slight variations on one another. And I think when we talk about like keto in particular, the kind of real emphasis there is the low carb. And so I often get people on client calls who will say they have kind of a low carb diet or they kind of like do the Atkins diet, but the real emphasis on the keto diet is keeping it very low, between that 5 kind of to 10%. The reason being with other diets like Atkins, etc., you're not necessarily wanting to put yourself into ketosis and maintain that ketosis state. Whereas the key element of the keto diet is such low carbohydrates that our only kind of energy reserve and our fuel store is ketone bodies. So that's the predominant difference. Again, there are some other subtle differences. Atkins diet tends to increase your protein intake, whereas on the keto diet, they tend to kind of say we want to increase fat, not necessarily protein, because there is a process by which proteins themselves can get converted into glycogen, which is essentially what we're trying to avoid. So the real emphasis here is that low carbohydrate, moderate proteins, and very high fat intake.
Got it. Got it. Okay. That makes great sense. So, people often associate in the modern day keto with weight loss. And so definitely the effectiveness always comes into question. In fact, one of the studies that I kind of pulled up in this process was from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And it was a study done by Kevin Hall that basically said, while it noticed a slight increase in calorie burning, it didn't necessarily lead to faster fat loss. And early on, weight loss slowed because the body lost water and glycogen first. And even though insulin levels dropped a lot, fat burning actually increased, but that didn't increase overall fat loss. So I guess what is the science behind that? And is that something that often is recommended as like a fat loss tool?
Yeah, and I guess this is an interesting one, and this is where kind of science becomes kind of, is it a science, is it an art, is it slightly different between one person to the other? And that was actually a super interesting study. And again, there's mixed evidence, and like the study you found, it didn't actually result in weight loss. There are other ones that indicate that actually keto as a diet is quite good for weight loss. And again, it goes back down to if we're kind of reducing our carbohydrate intake, generally they get converted into triglycerides, which are kind of our surplus energy that gets stored as triglycerides. The polite way of saying fat. So by decreasing our carb intake, we're getting decreased kind of storage of fat reserves in the first instance. And then by switching our metabolism from predominantly glucose-based to ketone bodies, we're then utilizing and burning those fat stores as opposed to storing them. So generally, it does have some reasonable evidence for weight loss, but again, it depends on your metabolism, your body habitat initially, your activity levels, etc. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all.
Would you say so one thing about this study that, I forgot to mention is that it was not done on a prolonged period of time. And so is there like a differentiation between maintaining keto for months on end or potentially even years? Or is there like a cyclical component or like a short-term deviation across like short-term keto versus long-term keto has different effects?
Yeah, so I think all the evidence is that keto is effective, but again, it's all kind of individualized. So for people who might be high performance athletes, etc., then actually doing cyclical keto, so where you might do kind of do 1 and 5 days, kind of sticking to your keto diet, and then you might have 2 days where actually you introduce some carbohydrate intake to support a kind of intense training period, to support an endurance event that you're doing, etc. And that tends to work for people who are still wanting to maintain this kind of activity intensity. And similarly, other people tend to have kind of like an on-off approach where they will target their carbohydrate intake around exercise. So if they know they're going to the gym or they're going for a run, etc., introducing carbs kind of 60 minutes before you're about to do some intense exercise can help just kind of bolster those kind of energy stores for that period whilst maintaining kind of ketosis the majority of the time. And again, if that's what your lifestyle is, if you are exercising, if you're going to the gym, if you're a performance athlete, etc., these might be beneficial ways to kind of approach keto. If you're more sedentary, then actually the evidence might be that you'd benefit from kind of maintaining keto predominantly the majority of the time.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think we'll break down a little further on some of the specific kind of use cases on which people. But I want to talk a little bit about keto's effect on metabolic health at just different markers. So, because what is the overall impact of keto on metabolic health, whether that's insulin resistance, just people with type 2 diabetes, kind of like that specific, you typically correlation there because like the glycogen storages and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. It has really good evidence in terms of like particularly people with obesity or people with diabetes, particularly people with obesity and diabetes. And so the kind of pathology behind that is essentially reducing our glycogen scores, reducing our carbohydrate intake. We decrease the amount of glucose spikes we're getting throughout the day. And by decreasing the amount of glucose spikes we're getting, we decrease the amount of insulin we have to be producing. The kind of consequent effects of this is we maintain more insulin sensitivity. So we're having to produce less amounts to have the same effect. And by increasing our insulin sensitivity, we're decreasing our sugar levels while maintaining our insulin levels. And that tends to have net positives for metabolic control, particularly in people who might be progressing towards kind of diabetic insulin resistance type profiles.
Got it. And you kind of mentioned the effect on triglycerides, but what about LDL, HDL? Like, I guess, what's the typical effect from keto on those markers?
Yeah, generally speaking, the effect of HDLs is that the keto diet bolsters our HDLs. It decreases your triglycerides, increases your HDLs. That's generally seen more kind of universally across the board. LDLs, however, present a more kind of complex, nuanced picture. The scientific evidence is quite kind of mixed in terms of the LDLs, and there tends to be kind of three main kind of categories. The people whose LDLs remain the same, the people whose LDLs increase, and the people whose LDLs decrease. As a result of that, more evidence is developing in terms of the size of our LDL particles. Are there these kind of smaller, more dense particles that are generally considered to be more harmful? Or are there these larger, more fluffy particles that generally are considered less harmful? There's also been kind of the development of phenotypes. So you might have heard of lean mass hypertrophic responders, which is a particular kind of phenotype that might be seen during keto. And that tends to apply to people who are quite kind of lean generally, an increase in their LDLs, whereas their kind of HDLs also are increased and their triglycerides tend to be really quite low. Again, whether these LDLs are harmful or not is kind of the next step in investigating the keto diet and trying to work out if this is kind of like net beneficial from a purely cardiovascular standpoint, or if there are drawbacks from a cardiovascular standpoint. And I think that's kind of the emergence of the science we're going to see in the next kind of few years.
Got it. Yeah, one of the things we covered. I mean, I know there's studies from both ends of the spectrum, but one of our biomarker breakdown episodes, when we talked about LDL, HDL, there was like this 2018 study that focused on cholesterol levels of endurance athletes who followed keto, and basically athletes on the diet who had much higher levels of LDL also had higher HDL levels. So like it was this weird relationship. But then they also found was that the low carb athletes had more LDL, but the type of LDL they had was less harmful. So it was kind of just what you're talking about was one of the things we covered. So it's interesting. I'm interested in like keto sometimes recently has been associated with mental clarity, any kind of cognitive benefits. I guess, just, is there any science backing behind that? What are things that you've seen in terms of keto and correlations to neurological function?
Yeah, so I guess this goes a little bit back to what you said at the start in terms of it initially being kind of found as a treatment for things like epilepsy. So essentially, I think in refractory epilepsy, so epilepsy that is resistant to treatment, there has been some significant evidence that having a predominantly keto diet reduces kind of the amount of seizures they have by circa 50%. So there is some good evidence to say it kind of improves or decreases the oxidative stress we might be seeing. It also increases kind of the health of our like neurotransmitters. And it also helps because ketone bodies can cross the blood-brain barrier, which kind of our carb-based sources of fuel cannot. And again, this kind of taps into when we talk about our type 3 diabetes, so things kind of like Alzheimer's, etc. There is also some emerging evidence to suggest that keto might be beneficial in those types of conditions as well.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I think it'd be like a good one to watch as we kind of develop our kind of Alzheimer's treatments for sure.
Yeah, well, curious, just kind of, question ad hoc. Like over these studies specifically, how do they differ over time? Like we talked about it very, very briefly, how the study that was not over a prolonged period of time, but for something like that, for type 3 diabetes, is that a study you would have to conduct for over a long period of time, or is that like something you would see physiologically affecting someone pretty early on?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of when we get into, we really start to test like the rigor of our scientific studies. And there's lots of discrepancies. So I think we kind of talked about a study at the start, which was kind of only for a few week period. There was a particular study that lasted for a 2-year period, and they looked at the adherence levels to a keto diet over that period and found that people generally adhered to it about 74% of the time. In terms of some of these things, so the effects we see of the keto diet, we kind of initially see this kind of alteration status where we're going through a flux, where we're transitioning our kind of metabolism. And then generally we see the benefits certainly after kind of a 1 month period of being in kind of that keto state. depending on the individual. Some people kind of sink into keto quite easily within like a week period. Other people go through this real flux of states when they're transitioning. They get alterations in their electrolyte balance, etc., and they can have some difficulties there. But generally speaking, in terms of the scientific evidence, I think for us to have really kind of good, rigorous, long-standing evidence that stands the test of time, we probably do need to be conducting these studies, not just over kind of a few months period, but ideally over a number of years. Obviously, that then comes with its own kind of disadvantages, especially in kind of things like type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's, in terms of, are we going to lose participants to kind of to potentially Alzheimer's or other diseases? Is there going to be fallout from that study? Is that going to affect the rigor of the study, etc.? So they're going to be pretty hard to conduct in the older population, but from a diabetic standpoint, from a weight loss standpoint, looking at kind of a younger generation, I think we've got the means to conduct like longer, more rigorous, kind of better quality studies there.
Yeah, I mean, probably the case for most things in medicine in general is kind of those two sides of the spectrum. Interested in the application layer now. So like, we have keto. We've talked a little bit about the science behind it in different applications. How does it affect markers? Now, like people specific. So athletes versus, obesity cases, diabetes, neurological conditions. We kind of have touched on all of them a little bit, but just like going much deeper, like what are the typical groups that you see keto being most successful with? You talked a little bit about like athletes, having to time it out, right? Are there other maybe people groups that we haven't really grouped in here that actually are incredibly important when we talk about keto to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I think one group that is kind of quite relevant to talk about, so people who have kind of issues with their pancreatic function are a particular kind of warning group in terms of kind of adopting a keto diet. The reason behind that is the pancreas is the organ that produces the digestive enzyme lipase, which is predominant role or pure function is to essentially break down fats. So if you're having a high fat diet and you're not able to break it down, then we're not going to see kind of the benefits of the keto diet. And actually there's going to be a kind of a negative sequelae to that. So proceed with caution if you have kind of pancreatic insufficiency or issues with your gallbladder. On the converse though, we've not really seen any issues with people who have two well-functioning kidneys and preserved kidney function. It doesn't have any kind of detrimental effects on kidney health. Similarly, it doesn't have any detrimental effect on the liver health, assuming that you have good liver health going into this. However, similar to the pancreas, a caveat to this would be people who have liver disease, because that kind of the conversion of those fatty acids into those ketone bodies predominantly happens in the liver. If you've got liver malfunction already, if your liver is not metabolizing as it should be, then that's when we're going to kind of start to see some issues. The other one that's quite relevant is people who might have an element of something like familial hyperlipidemia or genetic conditions that predispose them to kind of not metabolize their cholesterol in the same way. It's not that keto is off the cards for you, is that you might just need to be a little bit more stringent in terms of your monitoring. You might need to do more regular blood work, liaise with your healthcare provider, etc. Just while we're kind of uncertain about this effect on kind of it boosting our LDLs and the possible kind of cardiovascular side effects we're going to get as a consequence to that.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, now that we've covered a lot about keto, kind of interested, for people that are interested to pursue a keto diet, what's kind of what are your tips and tricks for starting? How do you prevent some of the common pitfalls, electrolyte imbalances, nutrient deficiencies? We talked about the edge cases. If you have these two things, probably not the best idea for you. But let's say you don't follow those categories. I guess first steps, is this something that you always recommend easing into? Again, if you're a first-time keto participant, is it better to be cyclical about it? Are there like targeted things that you should do? Just kind of walk us through some of that.
Yeah, sure. And again, person specific with this one. So no strong evidence that one way of kind of approaching keto works better than the other, whether you want to take a gradual approach and just gradually reduce your carbohydrates over a 2-week period, or whether you want to go more for like the cold turkey approach and can reduce your carbohydrates on a more abrupt kind of scale. I guess the kind of the other things to consider in that is the psychology behind it. You're having to fundamentally change the way you eat. You're having to change the way you meal plan. You might have to, if you're also exercising, change the timings of your meals, etc. So for some people, it might be that gradual introduction is a little bit more preferable than that kind of very abrupt change. But from an evidence perspective, there's no kind of real suggestion that one way works better. It's again person specific. The thing I would say is for people who are kind of considering a keto diet is just to be really kind of conscious about your hydration levels and possibly increase your sodium intake. as we kind of start to alter our metabolism and our insulin levels changes, we get dips in our sodium levels. And when we get dips in our sodium levels, that can affect other kind of other salts in our body. And you can sometimes start to get symptoms that are undesirable, like headaches, weakness, fatigue, etc. So just being conscious about kind of your hydration status. And if you are exercising, you might want to do some carbohydrate intake just prior to that, especially while you ease into kind of the keto diet and might be going through this transition stage where you're getting non-desirable side effects.
Gotcha. Amazing. Well, Tasha, it's been a pleasure to talk about ketogenic diet with you. I want to move into this last part that I always ask with all the interviews. So I'd love for you to teach me something interesting. I can give a few seconds to think and just give us a quick blurb on something unrelated to what we just talked about that the users may find interesting.
Sure. Okay, this comes off the back of a documentary that I was watching last night, and I didn't know. You might know, if you manage to, or by some circumstances, manage to invert a shark, so you flipped it the other way around, they go into this state called isotonic hypnosis. I don't know if you've seen this at all, but essentially they kind of become paralyzed and immobile. And dolphins have started to utilize this technique by flipping the sharks because then they can attack them. So I thought that was quite an interesting technique. And there's a killer whale pod, I think, just off the coast of Canada, who this is now their predominant hunting technique. They flip the sharks, they go into this like isotonic technosis kind of trance-like state, and then get eaten. So that is my interesting fact. It's a niche one.
Okay, so maybe this is a new technique. I used to think that you're supposed to punch them in the nose, but now maybe the new thing is to flip them.
I think it'd be easier to punch it than to flip it, depending on shark size, but it depends how macho you're feeling.
Yeah, that's fair. Tasha, thank you so much. That is the Silken Fox podcast.
Perfect. Thank you.